Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome one and all to another live stream. I am privileged to be joined by Stephanie Mitchell Hughes, a lady I've been live streaming with for what seems like an awful long time, but thoroughly enjoyable time, talking about her own personal journey. We call it Resilience 2.0, through hard places to a point of, dare I say it, circumspection where we are now. I'm also very privileged to be joined by a gentleman, Frank Wilson, who is in fact current CFO of Houston First Corporation. And although business is not what we're talking about today, we are talking in reflection of our times and knowledge of an amazing figure in literary, civil rights, and just history of its own right. Of course, we're talking about Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And what I'm going to do is pitch first and talk about Spellman. And of course, for that, we need my dear friend Stephanie. So, Stephanie, I'm going to toss the baton over to you.
Okay, and then I'll toss to you, Frank,
Okay.
because we can't talk about Spellman without talking about Morehouse.
From what I've
And in
read,
this
they are
instance, we
inextricably
definitely,
linked.
we have to have both. So Frank is a good friend of mine, and I had the great privilege of attending Spelman College in Atlanta. That is where I went to school as an undergraduate. And Spelman, if you do not know, is an all-Black, all-women's HBCU, historically Black college university located in Atlanta, Georgia. It was founded in 1881 by two abolitionists, Sophia Packard and Harriet Giles. And it is a historic institution because it also educates the creme de la creme, almost, of the children of civil rights leaders. And we went to school. Frank and I went to school with many of these people whose either Bernice King was in the class behind mine, Dexter King would have been in the class ahead of Frank, and our friends were also, their parents were peers of Martin Luther King. And so it has always been interesting to me to talk about when we look at Martin Luther King and we have the Martin Luther King Day celebration, people talk about Dr. King from a vantage point of I have a dream speech or that type of thing. And I think it's interesting to give a perspective of having been sort of on the inside and with people whose parents knew him and worked with him and walked with him throughout the civil rights movement, and to get that see what they lived. And it's all just a walking, talking history lesson. And to give that perspective. One of the things, and I'll toss this to Frank, but one of the things that I was really interested to know and that I learned when I was in school is that Dr. Benjamin Mays, and I'll let Frank talk about Dr. Mays. He was Dr. King's mentor, and they had a group of other young men whose children were our classmates who they mentored, and they called them Buck Benny's boys.
Yes.
And I never, of course, would have ever known something like that. And so those are interesting things to know, to understand how these things, how Dr. King was shaped and how the individuals who shaped him, in some instances, were still around to shape and influence us. So
these are the same Buck Benny's boys that we were talking about.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Excellent. Yes. And what got me was that Spellman and other and in fact both institutions really promoted critical thinking at a time when critical thinking was a little bit downtrodden. Am I right? What say you, Frank?
Well, okay, I'm going to give a little bit of history, just as Stephanie did, and say Morehouse was founded in the basement of Augusta's Springfield Church in 1867, which was 4 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And if you recall, I live in Texas now, in Houston, and Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, but slaves were not freed in Texas until 1865, when Lincoln sent the Union Army down here to tell people, you have to free the slaves. And 2 years later, in Augusta, Georgia, which is the home of the famed Augusta Golf Course, Morehouse was founded.
Mm-hmm.
It was founded in the basement of a church to teach formerly enslaved men how to read, how to write, how to be educated, and how to find their way post enslavement, and become teachers and become ministers and become leaders. And I want to emphasize that, because leadership is one of the central tenets of what was poured into all of us at Morehouse. Not just leadership because you're important, but because you're obligated. The sense of obligation, because we were given certain privilege and advantage in a liberal arts education. So I got there as a freshman with Steph, and at that time, a part of Morehouse's commitment is unabashed Judeo-Christian values. Of course, there's academics. Of course, there's all sorts of opportunities to grow intellectually, but it's unabashed Judeo-Christian values. And you understood that coming in. And so one of the things that was part of our curriculum that was required was that on Tuesdays, it was freshman orientation. Thursdays, it was chapel. It wasn't a choice. You had to go. They took roll. And the chapel and freshman orientation were held at the Martin Luther King International Chapel. And outside that chapel stood a 25-foot bronze statue of Martin Luther King Jr. And he's pointing straight out. And what he's pointing at, we never knew. We would debate it. But we were, as Stephanie hinted, we were surrounded by not just the children of the civil rights, fathers of the movement, but Coretta Scott King spoke to us at chapel on Thursdays. Andy Young, former mayor, former ambassador at the United Nations, spoke to us regularly. Jesse Jackson, who ran for president while we were in school, spoke to us regularly. He was an enormous speaker who, from Chicago, I would come to know Jesse relatively well because I would live, when I graduated and moved to Chicago, at some point I moved into a home that was 3 blocks down the street from where Rainbow Push Operation was. And so Jesse was just a very social activist in Chicago, much more than what we have here where I live in Houston. But social activism was it was in the air at Morehouse. It was normal.
Right.
Because of who spoke to us and poured into us. And it wasn't just the civil rights leaders like Coretta Scott King and David Abernathy or Desmond Tutu. It was Jimmy Carter, former president. It was Esther Rolle, the famed actress. It was Nikki Giovanni. It was Ted Turner, the mouth of the South and the owner of Turner Enterprises and CNN. And when we were at school, CNN was somewhat new on the scene.
Yeah,
but it was global. And so we had all these international ideas, that we were fed as young freshmen, sophomores. And we all came, by and large, from solid middle-class families. There were a few of the wealthy kids that drove BMWs and had fabulous stereos, and their father, one of my my mates, hallmates in my first dormitory, his dad was the orthopedic surgeon for the Oakland A's. So he drove around in a BMW, but by and large, we were solid middle-class kids that came from solid middle-class families, and it was safe. It was really, really safe. And then it was an environment where intellectual prowess was why we were there. And so there was a competitiveness about who could get the highest score on the test. And then I'll say this last thing. Somehow it got put into our heads that we had an obligation to leave there, grow academically, and then don't forget where you came from. And so
Right.
what we would do is, no one told us to do this, but we'd go to the library and we'd be there until it closed at 10 or midnight. And then we'd come back to the dormitories and we'd sit in the hallways and we'd solve the world's problems.
Mm-hmm.
How do we know the world's problem? We watched CNN and we found out what was going on around the world. And we debated, oh, this would be my solution. Well, defend that. Why? Why would that be your solution? And you couldn't come without a strong response, because you'd be humiliated, because you had to bring your intellectual game, and of course it was always augmented by what you were learning in philosophy class.
This is exactly what I mean about critical thinking. This is the very bastion of critical thinking, right?
We took comparative religion. It was required. It was the liberal arts. We took philosophy. We took sociology. We took psychology. It was part of the required courses, the general study courses. And then we didn't just write papers, we just debated theories and ideas about how to solve the world. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Gareth.
Yeah, Frank is it's absolutely right. At Spelman, we kind of lucked out, whereas you guys had to go to chapel every Thursday for all 4 years. We only had to go to chapel once a week freshman year. It used to be at Spelman that you had to go to chapel. I mean, I think it was like something like every day, in the years before. But the thing that's also was really interesting is that we had generations of Spelman women who taught us. And it's so interesting. And just like I said, it was like a walking daily in-person history lesson. Pearl Cleage taught me and some other 18-year-old. Well, I would have been 18 because I would have been amongst the youngest in my class. But 18 and 19-year-olds, she had us reading The Color Purple before The Color Purple was The Color Purple. And when I think about that, I think, gosh, from her vantage point, and as a writer and as a teacher and as a thinker and being very socially and politically aware as a person, she is teaching such an important work like The Color Purple to 18 and 19-year-olds and trying to help us understand that. And then you think about Sisters Chapel on Spelman's campus. And Sisters Chapel was such a historic and rich place because Martin Luther King was, I guess you would say he was, I will say repose. So his viewing was held after he was assassinated on Spelman's campus. And then we go and revere that space because every Christmas, Morehouse and Spelman's Glee Club, they join together and they have Joyce Johnson plus others have come alongside her, but Joyce Johnson to play that beautiful and majestic organ in Sisters Chapel. When she retires and says she will not play that organ anymore, I mean, insofar as I'm concerned, they should simply dismantle it and just take it down and just because I don't know who could ever come along and play that organ as beautifully as she has played it for, I don't know, it's got to be over 50 years at this point. And, so it's that, I mean, I think that when I think about Martin Luther King and Dr. Martin Luther King and all that he did, and I can't help but think about it in tandem with Morehouse and in tandem with Spelman. And then to mention Dr. Christine King Ferris, she was head of the English department, education department on Spelman's campus. And she's Dr. King's sister. And she was always, it didn't matter what time of day it was. It could be 8 o'clock in the morning, always immaculately dressed from head to toe, always. And that, I mean, that is the legacy. And then we graduate and they send us out and release us to just change the world. And that basically, and that is what is happening across this country.
Well, let's as I said at the beginning in my introduction, I'm particularly interested in both of your viewpoints of how Martin Luther King's, Dr. King's legacy has affected America in the modern day, in 2024. I'm going to toss it first over to you, Frank. You're in finance, you're in commerce. You must see firsthand how a black man is treated within revered company. Has that changed in your mind? Are you considered equal? I'm being blunt, but I need to.
Am I considered equal? No. And I say that based on, am I
Forgive
qualified?
me if I come across a rude.
No. Am I qualified and perceived as such? Yes. But in order to be qualified and perceived as competent, and you have to be a lot better than the average person, non-black person. You just have to be some people. Sometimes you hear the word a unicorn. Blacks in professional spaces have to be twice as good. That's what our parents told us when we were being raised. You have to be twice as good in order to be considered equal. And so you have to be twice as, you have to prepare, you have to go to school. But I thought I would give you this little anecdote because you talked about King. And one of the things that I did very recently was in Houston, where I live, I went to the Gandhi Museum as a work activity at Mahatma Gandhi exhibit. We have a very large East Asian population in Houston, and there is a very incredible Mahatma Gandhi Museum, and the museum caretaker said it's the only one in the U.S. And so, as a work event, a diversity, equity, and inclusion event done by our HR department, we go there, and I went, and there's a bronze statue of Gandhi in the front of it, and then there's panels behind him outside. We're not even inside yet, but there are panels behind him. And then, what do you know? One of those panels is Martin Luther King. Another one of those panels is the former president of South Africa. And so the influence of Gandhi, they could have, the Gandhi Museum could have, put forth Gandhi's legacy any way they wanted to, but they chose Dr. King because he was one of his devoted students, who brought Gandhi's philosophy to the U.S. And when I look around, I travel a reasonable amount internationally. My daughter just got back from London a few days ago, where she had an internship. She was there this summer, and so I'm a fan of Europe and France and London and the UK.
Oh, not those terrible French people.
No.
They still haven't forgiven us for Agincourt,
Oh, wow. So my impression is that because of the sacrifices made by Dr. King, and because of his intellect, and because of his decision of approaching equality via nonviolent means, and
then that's the Gandhi legacy right there, isn't it?
All right.
Non-violent civil disobedience. Correct.
Because of his and Baynard Rustin and others, the strategies, there was a lot of intellectual, heft that went into designing the strategies. And then above all of that, humility, right? Right now, if you take a leadership training course in my space, they talk a lot about humility as a leader. He had to be very humble and willing to swallow his pride and be physically abused, verbally abused. And he has become, his particular leadership style has become one that, when Stephanie was talking about what she read in English, I read the letter from a Birmingham jail in freshman year when they were teaching us composition. We read, that was an example of one of the pieces of literature that we read as a model for writing a persuasive essay. It's packed with power and pushback, but pushback against the other spiritual community members who were saying, no, it's too soon, not now. Can you just wait? And he wrote this handwritten letter from a Birmingham jail that is now, famous. So I think when I look and compare the civil rights movements that he was at he was ground zero along with others. He didn't do it alone, but he was the brilliant spokesman and the brain trust for the leadership team for the civil rights movement. Other countries like France have not quite caught up because they didn't have, So it's still, again, I was in South Africa between Christmas and New Year's, and I went to Cape Town, and it's a little different there, and it's 70%.
Cape Town's a very odd place.
Yeah, it's complicated. That's the word I use. Complicated.
Very complicated. Don't stop at traffic lights for too long. Do you know what they call traffic lights in South Africa?
I do. Yeah. It's the left side driving that gets me because I'm used to driving on the right side, of course. But that's kind of what you do. I'm sure in the UK.
I'm sorry, you're driving on the wrong side. We're driving on the right side. But let me just thank you very much, Frank. It's helpful to get your perspective. I need Spellman Girl to jump into the mix now. Look, modern America. We've discussed this to death, you and I.
Yes.
Modern America still doesn't see a black woman is capable of much more than scrubbing doorsteps. I'm sorry, but that seems to be the way it is, and it's a crying shame. It feels like we haven't traveled anywhere. I'm sorry, Frank. I think that it's amazing. Your achievements alone speak volumes. The fact that you've had to go twice as far to get to stay in the same place is terrible. But I'm sorry for the black woman. I think it's worse.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I've been back and forth about this because I've been asked this type of question before.
Of course.
And at first I thought it's much more difficult to be a woman. But I think that it's I think at this point I have gone to the other side. The thing, though, is I don't and refuse to allow myself to be defined according to the way that others choose to perceive me.
Quite right.
Now, I just refuse to do that. And I was on a panel earlier this week where we were talking about Black women in the legal profession and what it was like. And we had an extremely frank conversation, brutally honest conversation, and it was at a conference. And it's tough. We wear a mask. We wear a mask and an armor every single day because we are in spaces as unicorns. We are in these spaces all the time when we can never ever be fully ourselves. And the thing with the pandemic is that now, you've got people refusing to go back to work and not wanting to go back into the office. Right. And there are all kinds of reasons given. But the thing that's really interesting is that no one ever really talks about this idea that I'm not going back into the office because my mask and my armor no longer fit. And, it's tough being Black and living in America. It's really, really hard. At the same time, and this is the reason why I say that it is tough to be Black and then to be female in this country. But at the same time, there is absolutely nothing. I would never trade being Black and being a Black woman for anything. Despite all, if I look back over all 400 years, I would, of all that we've endured and what's in my DNA and what my children carry and all the unresolved stuff, I would never, ever, ever trade being a Black woman. And because we're just brilliant. I mean, it would be a slap in the face of the legacy of being at Spelman and having gone to school with my classmates from Morehouse to say otherwise, because of all that I saw and the people who I've met and what I was allowed to do and the people who taught me and what they exposed me to. So that's my response, Gareth. I don't know if it's a real response, but it's
I
not.
think it can only be a real response because it's yours.
Okay.
I think that makes it valid. Guys, I'm only painfully aware that Frank must be elsewhere, and I thank you very much for your perseverance with us. I know we're running a couple of minutes over. I just wanted to say thank you both for taking your time out of your days. I know you're both busy, and to be with us today. I think I'm just going to say one thing. As a white Jewish man who was both autistic and dyslexic, I've always felt I was in an underclass of my own anyway. I've always found people like Gandhi, like Dr. King, almost an indicator that there is light at the end of the tunnel, because these are solid methodologies and solid directions to take that can only lead to a better, more integrated society. And that is the one thing I take from the mess that is modern politics on both sides of the pond. Is that there are still people who believe, and I'm one of them, that non-violent critical thinking can only lead to the betterment of society. And on that note, I thank you both, and I look forward to continuing many more wonderful conversations with Stephanie. At some point, Frank, it would be lovely if I could have you back on. But until then, I wish everybody a safe and wonderful weekend, and of course, good mental health.
Thank you so much.